The black car was parked across the street again, and Claire Whitfield noticed it the second she unlocked the front door of the diner. It was 6:50 in the morning, the sky still gray, and the street was empty except for that one car with its engine quietly running. She stood at the door a moment longer than she needed to, her hand still on the lock, watching the fogged windows of the vehicle for any sign of movement. Nothing. No one got out. No one drove away. It just sat there, waiting, the way a held breath waits before it either escapes or stays trapped. She told herself it was nothing. Probably someone waiting for a delivery, or a driver catching a few extra minutes of sleep before an early shift. Lahore had strange hours sometimes, and so did small towns everywhere, and diners like this one saw every kind of stranger pass through. But something about the stillness of that car made her stomach tighten in a way she could not explain. By 7:15, the tension had folded itself into the back of her mind, the way worries do when work takes over. The bell above the door rang, and there he was, right on schedule, an elderly man in a tweed coat that had seen better decades, moving slowly toward the corner booth by the window. Walter Doyle. He always sat in the same seat, always ordered the same black coffee, and always folded his hands together like a man in the middle of a long and private conversation with himself. But today something was different. Claire noticed it before he even sat down. His eyes moved quickly across the room, checking the corners, checking the window, checking the door behind him. His hands, usually steady enough to lift a coffee cup without spilling a drop, trembled as he pulled out his chair. He looked, for the first time in the many months she had known him, afraid. "Morning, Walter," she said, keeping her voice light as she set his coffee down in front of him. "You're up early, even for you." He managed a small smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Old habits. An old man's mind doesn't rest the way it used to." Claire had learned, over the months, to read the space between his words as carefully as the words themselves. There was always something Walter left out, some careful edge he trimmed off his sentences before handing them to her, and she had never pushed him for more than he wanted to give. It was one of the reasons, she suspected, that he kept coming back. "You want your usual eggs?" she asked, sliding into the small talk that made mornings feel normal again. "Please," he said, and then, after a pause, added quietly, "Claire, if a stranger ever comes asking about me, you don't know anything. You understand?" The words landed strangely in the warm, coffee-scented air of the diner. Claire blinked, unsure whether to laugh it off or take it seriously. "Walter, what's going on?" "Nothing you need to worry about," he said, patting the table gently, the way someone pats the hand of a nervous child. "Just an old man being careful, that's all." She wanted to press further, but a group of construction workers came through the door just then, loud and hungry, and the moment passed the way most quiet mornings did, swallowed by the noise of ordinary life. Still, as she poured coffee for the new arrivals, her eyes kept drifting back to the window, back to the street, back to that black car that had finally, sometime in the last 10 minutes, disappeared. Claire had been working at the diner for almost 3 years, ever since she'd left community college 1 semester short of a degree she couldn't afford to finish. The diner, a squat brick building on the edge of town called Doran's, was not glamorous. The coffee machine groaned like an old man climbing stairs, the booths were patched with tape in more than one place, and the owner, a kind but tired man named Frank Doran, paid just enough to keep his small staff from leaving. But Claire liked it there. She liked the rhythm of it, the regulars who became familiar faces, the quiet satisfaction of making someone's morning a little warmer than it would have been otherwise. Walter had started coming in a year and a half ago, appearing one gray Tuesday morning like he'd always been part of the place. He never talked about family. He never mentioned friends. He paid an exact change, counted twice, and left no trace of himself beyond the empty coffee cup and the folded napkin he always left square in the center of his plate. Claire had started slipping him extra food early on, a piece of pie here, a larger portion there, telling him the kitchen had made too much. He never questioned it, though she suspected he knew exactly what she was doing. There was a dignity in the way he accepted her small kindnesses, neither embarrassed nor entitled, simply grateful in the quiet way of a man who had learned not to expect much from the world anymore. Over the months, he had begun to open up in small pieces. He told her about his wife Margaret, who had passed years earlier from an illness he never named in detail. He told her he had worked most of his life in industry, something involving machines and factories, though he was vague about the specifics in a way that made Claire assume it simply bored him to talk about work. He mentioned a son once, briefly, his voice tightening around the word in a way that told her not to ask more. She never pushed. That was the unspoken agreement between them, built morning by morning over 100 small exchanges. She gave him warmth without demanding answers, and he gave her stories without ever handing over the whole truth. But that morning, the morning of the black car and the trembling hands, something in their quiet agreement had shifted. She brought him his eggs, and he ate slowly, his eyes drifting to the window every few minutes. The diner filled and emptied around him in its usual rhythm, but Walter remained apart from it, an island of tension in a sea of ordinary chatter. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the counter, reaching into his coat pocket. "Keep the change," he said, sliding a few crumpled bills toward her, more than the bill required. "Walter, that's too much. Let an old man be generous for once," he said, and there was something final in the way he said it, something that made Claire's chest tighten with a worry she could not name. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, more like a question than a statement. He looked at her for a long moment, his pale eyes soft beneath his heavy brows. "I hope so, Claire. I really do." He walked out into the gray morning, and Claire watched him go, watched him glance both ways down the empty street, before disappearing around the corner, moving with more urgency than his usual slow shuffle. She stood there long after he'd gone, the bell above the door still faintly swinging, and told herself, again, that it was nothing. But the black car came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and each time, Walter arrived a little more tense, a little more watchful, until Claire could no longer convince herself that an old man's fear over his morning coffee was simply the product of age or imagination. Something was following Walter Doyle, and whatever it was getting closer. That night, after her shift ended, Claire sat in her small apartment above a laundromat, staring at her phone without really seeing it. Her roommate, Ruby, a nursing student with the schedule of someone perpetually exhausted, had left a note on the fridge about groceries, but Claire's mind was elsewhere, replaying the fear in Walter's eyes, the tremble in his hands, the strange warning about strangers asking questions. She thought about calling someone, but who would she call? The police, to report a suspicious car that was no longer there, based on the anxious behavior of an elderly man who had done nothing but eat breakfast. It would sound absurd out loud, and yet the unease sat heavy in her chest, refusing to be reasoned away. She thought back over the months of conversations, searching for anything that might explain what was happening now. The vague mentions of industry, the tightness around the word son, the careful way he counted his coins, as though every dollar mattered more than it should to a man who somehow always managed to leave a generous tip. None of it added up to an answer. It only added up to more questions, each one sharper than the last, circling in her mind long after she finally closed her eyes and tried, without much success, to sleep. The next morning, she arrived at the diner early, before Frank had even unlocked the storage room, and found herself standing at the window, watching the street the way Walter had taught her to watch it, though she hadn't realized until that moment that she'd learned anything from him at all. The street was empty. No black car, no shadow waiting in the gray dawn light. At 7:15, the bell rang, and Walter walked in, and for a moment, seeing him there, ordinary and unharmed, folding into his usual booth with his usual quiet dignity, Claire felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. But as she set his coffee down in front of him, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beneath his hand on the table, half hidden by his sleeve, as though he had been debating, right up until she arrived, whether to show it to her at all. "Walter," she said carefully, "what is that?" He looked down at the paper, then up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his careful composure seemed to crack just slightly at the edges, revealing something underneath that looked almost like relief at finally being seen. "I think," he said slowly, "it might be time I told you a few things." Claire pulled out the chair across from him, something she had never done before during a shift, and sat down, ignoring the growing line of morning customers waiting at the counter behind her. Whatever Walter was about to say, she understood, without needing to be told, that it mattered more than anything else happening in the diner that morning. "I'm listening," she said, and Walter Doyle, folding his trembling hands together one more time, began to speak. Walter's voice, when he finally began, was quieter than usual, as though he were afraid the words themselves might carry too far if spoken at their normal volume. He glanced once more toward the window, confirming the street was empty, before he unfolded the piece of paper and set it flat on the table between them. "Years ago," he said, "I built something. A company. It started small, just me and two other men working out of a rented garage, fixing machine parts for factories that couldn't afford new equipment. Over time, it grew into something much larger than any of us expected. By the time I stepped back from running it, the company employed thousands of people across several states." Claire stared at him, trying to reconcile this new information with the man sitting across from her, the man who counted his coins twice and wore a coat with a frayed collar. "Walter, if you built something that big, why are you here? Why do you count out exact change every morning like every dollar matters?" He smiled faintly, though there was little humor in it. "Because every dollar does matter, Claire. Not because I don't have money. Because money, when it's the only thing people see in you, becomes a kind of poison. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I've spent the last several years trying to live without it defining who I am." He explained, slowly and carefully, that he had a son named Nathan, a man now well into his 40s, who had grown up believing the family fortune was owed to him, simply by right of birth. When Walter's wife, Margaret, passed away, something in Nathan had hardened. He had begun pushing for control of the company earlier and earlier, framing his father's slower pace and quieter decisions as signs of failing health, failing judgment, failing relevance. "He wanted me declared unfit," Walter said, his voice flat, though Claire could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "He hired doctors who had never spent more than 20 minutes with me. He built a case, piece by piece, designed to convince a court that I could no longer manage my own affairs, so that he could manage them instead." "That's terrible," Claire said, and meant it completely. "What did you do?" "I disappeared," Walter said simply. "Not forever. Just long enough to think clearly, away from lawyers and doctors, and my son's carefully rehearsed concern. I left the company under the management of people I trusted, moved to a small apartment across town under a name close enough to my own that I wouldn't forget to answer to it, and I started coming here, to this diner, because it was close enough to walk to, and far enough from anywhere Nathan would think to look." Claire thought back over the many mornings they'd shared, the quiet conversations about his late wife, the vague mentions of industry that she had assumed meant something modest, a factory floor perhaps, not an empire built from a rented garage. It was strange, she realized, how much she had come to care about a man whose entire history had been hidden from her, folded away like the napkin he always left square on his plate. "The car," she said, "the one that's been parked outside. You think it's your son?" "I think it's someone he's hired," Walter said. "Private investigators, most likely. Nathan has resources and patience, and he has never been a man who gives up easily once he's decided he wants something. I had hoped I would have more time before he found me. What happens if he does find you?" Walter's eyes drifted to the window again, and for a long moment he said nothing, his silence heavier than any answer could have been. "Then I suspect the quiet life I've built here comes to an end," he said finally, "and I go back to being the man everyone else decides I should be, instead of the man I've chosen to become." Claire reached across the table without thinking, and placed her hand over his trembling one. It was a small gesture, the kind she might have made for any customer struggling through a hard morning, but the way Walter looked at her afterward suggested it meant something larger to him, something he hadn't expected to receive from anyone in a very long time. "You don't have to face it alone," she said, "whatever happens. You're a kind woman, Claire," Walter said, his voice thick. "Kinder than you know. I want you to remember that I noticed. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that your kindness was never wasted on me." The words carried a weight that unsettled her, a finality she didn't like the sound of, but before she could ask him what he meant, the bell above the door rang, and a man in a gray suit stepped inside, scanning the diner with quick, deliberate eyes. Claire felt Walter's hand tense beneath hers. The stranger was tall, clean-shaven, with the kind of posture that suggested military training or years of disciplined habit. His gaze moved from booth to booth until it landed on Walter, and something in his expression sharpened, though he made no move to approach. "Go to the back," Walter whispered urgently. Please, Claire, just for a few minutes. I'm not leaving you here with him. You have to trust me, Walter said. I need you to trust me. Reluctantly, Claire rose from the table, though she didn't go far, retreating instead to the counter, where she could watch the exchange, while pretending to organize the coffee cups stacked beside the register. The stranger approached Walter's booth slowly, his hands visible, his posture non-threatening in a way that felt almost rehearsed, as though he had been trained specifically on how to appear harmless while remaining alert. Walter Doyle, the man said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. You've made a mistake, Walter replied evenly. My name is Walter Hale. Mr. Doyle, the stranger said again, ignoring the correction entirely. My name is Gordon Blake. I represent the legal interests of your estate. I've been asked to locate you, not to bring you back against your will, but to inform you of certain developments you need to be aware of. Claire watched Walter's shoulders stiffen, though his voice remained carefully controlled. What kind of developments? Gordon Blake glanced briefly toward Claire at the counter, then back to Walter, lowering his voice slightly, though not enough to keep Claire from hearing every word. Your son has filed a formal petition with the court, requesting an emergency hearing regarding your competency. If the petition succeeds, control of the company and your personal assets would transfer to him within 30 days. I've been trying to reach you for weeks to prepare a response, but you've made yourself remarkably difficult to find. That was rather the point, Walter said dryly. I understand your reasons, Gordon said, and something in his tone suggested genuine respect rather than mere professional courtesy. But if you don't appear to contest this petition, the court will have little choice but to rule based on the only evidence presented, which is entirely your son's. You need to come back, Mr. Doyle. Not permanently if that's not what you want, but at least long enough to be seen and heard by a judge who can determine the truth for themselves. Walter was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting once more toward Claire, who stood frozen at the counter, coffee cups forgotten in her hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to reach back years, decades even. Exhaustion accumulated slowly and finally reaching its limit. Give me a few days, he said. I need to put a few things in order first. I don't think you understand the urgency of the situation, Gordon said carefully. I understand it perfectly, Walter replied, an edge of steel entering his voice that Claire had never heard from him before. A glimpse, perhaps, of the man who had once built an empire from a rented garage. I've spent my whole life understanding the urgency other people assign to my decisions. Give me a few days, Mr. Blake, or find yourself explaining to a judge why my legal representative pressured a 78-year-old man against his stated wishes. Gordon studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, a flicker of something like respect crossing his features. 3 days, he said. After that, I can't guarantee the court will wait any longer. He left a business card on the table, glanced once more toward Claire with an expression she couldn't quite read, and walked out of the diner as quietly as he had entered. Claire returned to the booth immediately, sliding into the seat across from Walter, her heart pounding with questions she didn't know how to organize into words. You lied to him, she said finally. About your name. Old habit, Walter said, though his hands were shaking now, more visibly than before. I suppose it doesn't matter much anymore. He found me. Which means, eventually, Nathan will find me too. What are you going to do? Walter was quiet for a long time, staring down at the folded piece of paper still resting on the table between them, the one he had unfolded but never fully explained. Finally, he slid it across the table toward her. I want you to have this, he said. Not now. Keep it safe, and don't open it unless something happens to me. Do you understand? Not unless something happens. Claire took the paper with trembling fingers, feeling its weight far exceed its size. Walter, you're scaring me. I don't mean to scare you, he said gently. I only mean to be careful. A man in my position learns to prepare for outcomes he hopes never arrive. Will you keep it safe for me, Claire? Can I trust you with that much? Of course, she said, though the word barely made it past the tightness in her throat. But I want you to promise me something too. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll let me help, if there's anything I can do. Walter reached across the table and squeezed her hand, his grip surprisingly firm despite the tremor still running through it. You've already helped more than you know, he said. Every single morning, for over a year, You've helped simply by seeing me as a person, instead of a problem to be managed. That matters more than you understand, Claire. It matters more than any amount of money ever could. He rose from the booth slowly, gathering his coat around his thin shoulders, and for a moment, Claire feared he wouldn't return the next morning, that this conversation was itself a kind of quiet goodbye disguised as ordinary breakfast conversation. But he paused at the door, turning back to look at her one last time. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll see you tomorrow, same as always." She watched him walk out into the gray morning light, watched him check the street in both directions before disappearing around the corner, and she stood there long after the bell had stopped swinging, the folded paper clutched tightly in her hand, wondering what secrets it contained, and dreading, more than she wanted to admit, the possibility that she might have to find out sooner than either of them hoped. Walter did not come the next morning. Claire told herself, as 7:15 came and went, that traffic could explain it, or a doctor's appointment, or simply an old man's body finally demanding the rest. It had been denied for too long. She kept his coffee cup ready anyway, filled and waiting on the counter, growing cold as the morning rush filled the booths around his empty corner seat. By 8:30, the cup was still full, and Claire's hands had started shaking whenever she poured coffee for anyone else. Frank noticed, the way he noticed most things about his small staff, and pulled her aside near the kitchen door. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low enough that the customers wouldn't hear. "Walter didn't come in," she said. "He's never missed a day, Frank. Not once in a year and a half." Frank's expression shifted, something careful entering his features. "People get sick, Claire. People have families, appointments, lives outside these walls, even the quiet ones. Give it a day before you start worrying." But Claire had already spent the entire drive to work worrying, replaying the conversation with the man named Gordon Blake, the folded paper now hidden inside a shoebox in her closet, the tremor in Walter's hands as he'd told her about a son who wanted him declared unfit, simply to seize control of everything he'd built. A day felt like a very long time to wait when someone's safety might depend on much less. She finished her shift in a haze, wiping down tables mechanically, her mind circling the same unanswered questions. When her shift finally ended, instead of heading home, she found herself walking 3 blocks in the opposite direction, toward the small apartment building where Walter had once mentioned, only once, in passing, that he lived. The building was modest, brick and aging, the kind of place that asked few questions of its tenants, and offered even fewer amenities in return. Claire checked the row of mailboxes in the entryway, scanning names until she found one that made her chest tighten. W. Hale, apartment 14. She climbed the narrow staircase, her footsteps echoing against walls that hadn't seen fresh paint in years, and knocked on the door marked 14. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, calling his name softly, aware of how strange she must have looked, a young woman in a diner uniform pounding on an elderly stranger's door. The door across the hall opened instead, revealing a woman in her 60s wrapped in a faded cardigan, watching Claire with cautious curiosity. "You looking for Mr. Hale?" the woman asked. "Yes," Claire said quickly. "Do you know where he is? He didn't come to work this morning, and it's not like him." The woman's expression softened into something like sympathy. "2 men came by yesterday evening. Nice suits, quiet voices, the kind of men who look like they've never raised their voice in their lives but somehow still make you nervous. Mr. Hale left with them not long after. Didn't seem upset exactly. More like he'd been expecting them." Claire's stomach dropped. "Did you hear anything they said? Anything at all?" The woman thought for a moment, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. "One of them mentioned a hearing. Something about a court date, I think. I wasn't trying to listen, you understand. But these walls aren't what you'd call thick." Claire thanked her, though the words felt hollow leaving her mouth, and made her way back down the narrow staircase in a daze. A hearing. Gordon Blake had given Walter 3 days, and it seemed Walter, or perhaps circumstances beyond his control, had decided not to wait that long. She thought of the son, Nathan, a man she had never met but had already come to resent based entirely on Walter's careful, pained descriptions of him. She thought of doctors hired to declare a sharp, careful man unfit, simply because it was convenient for someone else's ambitions. Back at her apartment, Claire pulled the shoebox from her closet with trembling hands, staring at the folded paper Walter had given her, the one she had promised not to open unless something happened to him. Nothing had happened, she told herself. Not yet. He had simply gone to face a hearing, the very thing his lawyer had urged him to do. That wasn't the same as something happening. That was hope, even if it didn't feel that way sitting alone in her small apartment with Ruby's shift keeping her away until well past midnight. Still, she couldn't bring herself to put the paper away. She held it in her hands for a long time, turning it over, studying the careful fold lines, before finally, reluctantly, sliding it back into the shoebox and closing the lid. A promise was a promise, and if there was one thing Walter Doyle had taught her over the past year and a half, it was that a person's word mattered more than almost anything else in the world. The following days passed in a strange, suspended kind of anxiety. Claire went to work each morning, prepared his coffee out of habit before catching herself and setting it aside, and watched the empty booth by the window with an ache she hadn't expected to feel this deeply for a man she'd known for such a relatively short time. Frank, noticing her distraction, eventually pulled her into his small back office. "You need to let this go, Claire," he said, not unkindly. "I know you cared about him. Everyone who came through here could see that. But you don't know this man's whole life, and whatever's happening now, it's not something a waitress can fix by worrying herself sick over it." "He's my friend, Frank." "I understand that," Frank said, his voice softening. "But friends don't always tell each other everything, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do is trust that he's handling whatever this is, in whatever way he needs to handle it." Claire nodded, though the words did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She wanted to believe Frank was right, that Walter was simply navigating a difficult legal process the same way anyone might, with lawyers and hearings and careful, measured patience. But the trembling in his hands, the fear in his eyes that first morning she'd noticed the black car, the finality in his voice when he'd told her that her kindness had never been wasted on him, all of it circled back in her mind at night, refusing to let her rest easy. 5 days after Walter's disappearance, a man approached her outside the diner as she was leaving her shift, catching her attention with a soft clearing of his throat that made her jump. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his early 30s, wearing a simple jacket instead of a suit, his manner far less polished than Gordon Blake's had been. "Miss Whitfield?" he asked. "Claire Whitfield? Who's asking?" "My name is Peter Lang. I was hired by Mr. Doyle several months ago, before any of this began, to keep a discreet watch over his safety. He suspected, correctly as it turns out, that his son might eventually track him down." Claire studied him carefully, unsure whether to trust a stranger who knew both her name and Walter's true identity. "If you're supposed to be protecting him, where is he now?" "At a private facility outside the city," Peter said. "Under evaluation, ordered by the court, as part of the competency hearing his son requested. I wanted you to know he's safe. Frightened, perhaps, and understandably frustrated by the process, but safe. He asked me to find you, and let you know that he's thinking of you, and that he intends to keep his promise to see you again soon." Relief flooded through Claire so suddenly that she had to steady herself against the brick wall of the diner. "Is there anything I can do? Anything at all?" Peter considered the question for a moment. "Keep whatever he gave you safe," he said finally. "He mentioned he left something in your care. Whatever it is, it may matter a great deal before this is over. And Miss Whitfield, one more thing. Be careful who you speak to about any of this. Mr. Doyle's son has resources most people underestimate, and he won't take kindly to anyone standing between him and what he believes belongs to him." The warning settled over her like a cold weight, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder more often in the days that followed, watching for black cars that never seemed to appear when she expected them, only when her guard had finally begun to lower. 10 days after Walter's disappearance, on a rainy evening when Ruby was working a late shift at the hospital and the apartment sat silent around her, Claire heard a knock at her door. She approached cautiously, peering through the small peephole, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing in the dim hallway light was a man she had never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable, flanked by 2 others whose posture reminded her uncomfortably of the security details she'd seen escorting important figures on television. "Miss Whitfield," the man said through the door, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that made the small hairs on her arms rise. "My name is Gordon Blake. We spoke briefly once before, though perhaps you don't remember. I'm here regarding Walter Doyle." I need you to come with us. It's important, and I'm afraid it can't wait until morning." Claire's hand hovered over the deadbolt, torn between the instinct to keep it locked and the desperate hope that this visit meant Walter was finally safe, finally free of whatever legal storm had swallowed him for the past 10 days. She thought of the shoebox in her closet, the folded paper still sealed inside it, and the promise she had made not to open it unless something happened to him. Taking a slow breath, she unlocked the door. The car ride was silent for the first several minutes. Claire seated in the back beside Gordon Blake, while the two other men rode in front, their eyes constantly scanning the mirrors and the streets around them in a way that made her increasingly uneasy. She wanted to ask a dozen questions at once, but something about the tension in Gordon's posture told her to wait, that answers would come when he was ready to give them, and not a moment before. "Is Walter all right?" she finally asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. Gordon was quiet for a long moment, staring out the rain-streaked window at the passing streetlights. "He won his hearing," he said finally. 3 days ago, the judge reviewed the medical evaluations, listened to his testimony, and found him entirely competent to manage his own affairs. His son's petition was dismissed. Relief washed through Claire so powerfully that tears sprang unexpectedly to her eyes. "That's wonderful news. Why do you look like you're delivering something terrible then?" Gordon turned to face her, and in the dim light of passing street lamps, she saw an expression on his face that made her chest tighten with sudden dread. The stress of the hearing, combined with a heart condition he'd kept hidden from almost everyone, including his doctors for longer than he should have, proved too much for him. He passed away 2 nights ago, in his sleep, at the facility where he'd been staying during the evaluation. "I'm very sorry, Miss Whitfield. I know this isn't easy news to receive." The world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment, the rain on the window blurring into streaks of light that meant nothing, the low hum of the car's engine fading beneath the roaring silence in her own ears. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this was a possibility. She had feared it every single morning since his booth had first sat empty. But hearing it spoken aloud, in the careful, measured voice of a lawyer who had barely known him, made the loss suddenly, devastatingly real. "He didn't suffer," Gordon added gently, seeming to understand the shape of the silence that followed his words. "The staff at the facility said he passed peacefully, without pain. He had, in fact, spent his last evening writing letters. One of them was addressed to you." Claire pressed a trembling hand against her mouth, unable to speak for several long moments, as the car continued through the rain-soaked streets, carrying her toward a destination she hadn't yet asked about, though she suspected, given everything else unfolding around her, that it would matter greatly before the night was through. "Where are we going?" she finally managed to ask. "His attorney's office," Gordon said. "There are matters that need to be addressed tonight, before his son has the opportunity to interfere further. Mr. Doyle was very specific about how he wanted things handled, and very specific about wanting you present when certain documents were revealed." The office, when they arrived, occupied the top floor of a modest but well-kept building downtown, far removed from the diner's familiar streets and the small apartment Claire called home. She stepped out of the car, flanked by the 2 silent men who had ridden up front, their presence no longer merely unsettling but strangely comforting, given everything Peter Lang had warned her about regarding Walter's son and the resources he was willing to use against anyone standing in his way. Inside, seated around a long conference table, was a small gathering of people Claire had never met, an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes who introduced herself as Eleanor Voss, another attorney who had worked alongside Gordon for over a decade, a younger man named Simon Delacroix, described only as an accountant familiar with the Doyle family's finances, and, standing near the window with his arms crossed, and his expression carved from something colder than mere grief, a man Claire immediately recognized, without needing an introduction, as Walter's son. Nathan Doyle looked nothing like his father, where Walter had carried a quiet, careful dignity, even in the frayed collar of his old tweed coat. Nathan wore an expensive suit that seemed designed less for comfort than for the impression of power, his features handsome, but hardened by something that Claire could only describe as entitlement, long since curdled into resentment. "So this is her," Nathan said, his eyes raking over Claire with open disdain. "The waitress. I'd heard my father developed an unusual attachment in his final months, but I confess I expected someone slightly more remarkable." "Nathan," Gordon said, his voice carrying a warning that Claire suspected he had used many times before during long, difficult dealings with this particular family. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Nathan snapped, pushing away from the window. "My father spent his final weeks hiding in a diner, giving away money he should have been leaving to his own family, and now I'm expected to sit here and watch strangers profit from whatever confusion clouded his judgment before he died." "The court found him entirely competent," Eleanor Voss said crisply, not bothering to hide the edge in her own voice. "You tried that argument 3 days ago, Nathan, and it failed. I'd advise against repeating it here." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, retreating instead to a chair at the far end of the table, his eyes never fully leaving Claire, watching her with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable, though she forced herself to hold his gaze rather than look away. Gordon cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the matter at hand. Mr. Doyle updated his will approximately 3 weeks ago, shortly after the competency petition was first filed. Given the timing, and given that the update occurred after the court had already confirmed his full mental competency through independent medical evaluation, there is no legal basis on which this document can be reasonably contested. He opened a leather folder in front of him, removing several pages of dense legal text, though his eyes lifted first to Claire before he began reading. "Before I proceed with the formal reading," he said gently, "Mr. Doyle left a personal letter, which he specifically requested be read aloud before any discussion of the will itself. He was quite insistent about the order." Claire nodded, though her throat had tightened so completely, she wasn't certain she could have spoken even if asked to. Gordon unfolded a separate sheet of paper, one Claire recognized instantly by its careful handwriting, as matching the note Walter had once left tucked beneath his hand on their booth table, and began to read. "My dear Claire," Gordon began, his voice softening slightly as he spoke the words. "If you're hearing this letter read aloud, then I've finally run out of mornings, and I find myself more at peace with that thought than I expected to be, largely because of you. I want you to know that the 1.5 years we spent together, sharing coffee and quiet conversation in that small corner booth, meant more to me than nearly anything else in my very long life. You never once asked me for anything. You never once looked at me the way people look at an old man who has outlived his usefulness. You simply saw a person, tired and lonely, and you chose, morning after morning, to treat that person with warmth he had done nothing to earn. That kindness, Claire, given so freely and so consistently, taught me something I had forgotten over decades of building an empire that ultimately meant far less to me than a single cup of coffee shared with someone who genuinely cared whether I was all right." Gordon paused, glancing up briefly before continuing, his voice carrying the weight of every word, as though he understood, better than most, how rare such sentiments truly were. "I know money changes things, sometimes for the worse, and I want you to know that what follows is not meant to burden you or change who you are. It's meant simply as a thank you, inadequate as it may be, for reminding an old man that decency still exists in this world, freely given and quietly extraordinary. Take care of yourself, Claire. Take care of that diner, if Frank will let you. And please, if you're able, find some way to make sure no one else ever has to sit alone in a corner booth, feeling as invisible as I once did before you noticed me. With deepest gratitude, Walter." The room fell into a heavy silence following the letter's final words. Claire wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, aware of Nathan's cold stare from across the table but unable, in that moment, to care much about his obvious displeasure. Eleanor Voss cleared her throat gently, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to feel respectful before she spoke. "Given the personal nature of what's just been shared," she said, "I think it's appropriate we proceed with the formal reading of the will, so that everyone understands exactly where matters stand going forward." Gordon nodded, setting aside the personal letter with obvious care before returning to the thicker legal document in front of him. He began reading through the standard provisions first, the transfer of company leadership to a board of trusted executives Walter had personally selected months earlier, various charitable contributions to organizations supporting elderly care and community welfare, and provisions ensuring Nathan would retain a significant, though notably reduced, inheritance compared to what he likely would have received under the company's previous succession plan. Nathan's expression darkened with each provision, his jaw tightening further, though he remained silent, apparently understanding that any outburst now would only weaken whatever legal challenge he might still be contemplating. Then Gordon reached the final section of the document, and his eyes lifted once more to meet Claire's, holding her gaze steadily as he continued. To Claire Whitfield, he read, who showed me more genuine kindness in 18 months of shared mornings than I received from most people across the entirety of my adult life. I leave the sum of $4 million, along with full ownership of the property currently operating as Doran's Diner, to be transferred immediately upon confirmation of this will, with the understanding that Frank Doran shall retain full management rights and employment security for as long as he wishes to continue operating the establishment. Claire's hand flew to her mouth, the number so far beyond anything she had ever imagined that it took several long seconds to fully register. Across the table, Nathan's composure finally cracked entirely. "This is absurd," he snapped, rising from his chair so abruptly it scraped loudly against the polished floor. "A waitress, receiving millions, while I, his own son, am reduced to a fraction of what should rightfully be mine. This will be contested. I promise you all, this is far from over." "You're welcome to pursue that avenue," Eleanor said calmly, entirely unbothered by his outburst. "Though I'd remind you that the competency of the testator has already been formally established by the court, and the timing of these provisions leaves very little legal ground for a successful challenge. I'd advise you to consider carefully whether prolonging this dispute serves your interests, or simply your pride." Nathan glared around the room, his eyes lingering longest on Claire, cold and calculating in a way that sent an uneasy chill down her spine, despite the warmth of the office around her. Without another word, he turned and stormed out, the door slamming loudly behind him, leaving the remaining occupants of the room in a silence that felt, after everything, strangely peaceful in comparison. "He'll try something," Peter Lang said quietly from where he'd been standing near the back of the room, having accompanied Claire without her fully noticing his presence until now. Men like Nathan Doyle rarely accept defeat gracefully, particularly not defeat handed to them by someone they consider beneath their notice. "Let him try," Gordon said, closing the folder in front of him with quiet finality. "The paperwork is solid, the timing is defensible, and frankly, Miss Whitfield, your presence in Mr. Doyle's final months, and the genuine, well-documented nature of your relationship, will only strengthen the case should Nathan choose to pursue this further. For now, I'd simply advise you to take some time. This is a great deal to absorb in a single evening." Claire nodded numbly, still struggling to process everything that had unfolded over the past hour, the grief and gratitude and disbelief, all tangled together into something she couldn't quite name. As the meeting finally drew to a close and the others began gathering their papers, Eleanor Voss approached her quietly, offering a small, understanding smile. "He spoke about you often, these past few weeks," she said gently. "More than you might expect, given how briefly he knew you compared to a lifetime of other relationships. Whatever comes next, Miss Whitfield, know that you gave a lonely old man something money never could have bought him. That matters more than any number written on a legal document." Claire thanked her quietly, though her mind was already drifting elsewhere, toward the diner, toward Frank, toward the empty booth by the window that would never quite feel the same again, and toward the uncertain road that now stretched ahead of her, shaped by a kindness she had never expected to be repaid, and a loss she suspected she would carry, gently but permanently, for the rest of her life. 2 weeks passed before Nathan Doyle made his next move, and when it came, it arrived not as a quiet legal filing, but as a public spectacle, clearly designed to embarrass Claire before it could damage her legally. A local newspaper ran a story questioning the circumstances surrounding Walter's final will, quoting an anonymous source close to the family, who suggested the elderly businessman had been manipulated during a period of declining health by a young woman who had, in the source's words, positioned herself carefully to benefit from his vulnerability. Claire read the article standing behind the diner counter, her hands trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger she hadn't expected to feel so sharply. Frank, reading over her shoulder, muttered something under his breath that Claire suspected would have earned him a stern look from his late mother. "Don't let it get to you," he said, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "Everyone who actually knew Walter, everyone who watched the two of you together, morning after morning, knows exactly what kind of relationship that was. This is a man throwing mud because he's run out of legitimate arguments." Still, the article stung, and Claire spent much of that day distracted, replaying every kind word Walter had ever shared with her, searching them now for some hidden manipulation she knew, deep down, had never existed. It was Ruby, arriving home late that evening after a long hospital shift, who finally talked sense back into her. You gave a lonely old man company and kindness for 18 months, without expecting anything in return, Ruby said, dropping onto the couch beside her exhausted roommate. That's not manipulation, Claire. That's just decency. If his son wants to twist that into something ugly, because he can't stand watching someone else inherit what he believes belongs to him by birthright, that says everything about his character, and nothing about yours. The formal legal challenge, when it finally arrived a week later, proved far weaker than Nathan's confident public posturing had suggested. Eleanor Voss, representing the estate, methodically dismantled each argument during the brief hearing, presenting extensive documentation of Walter's competency evaluation, testimony from the facility staff who had cared for him during his final weeks, and, most powerfully, a series of handwritten journal entries Walter had kept during his time at the diner, entries that spoke, in his own careful handwriting, of the genuine comfort and friendship Claire had provided him during a period when he had felt increasingly isolated from his own family. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, dismissed Nathan's challenge within a single afternoon, ruling firmly that the will reflected the clear, competent, and voluntary wishes of a man fully capable of understanding and directing his own affairs. Nathan left the courthouse without a word to anyone, his expensive suit doing little to disguise the bitter set of his shoulders as he disappeared into a waiting car. Claire, for her part, found herself less interested in celebrating the legal victory than in figuring out what, exactly, she wanted to do with the strange, sudden weight of everything Walter had left behind. The money remained largely untouched in the weeks that followed, sitting in an account she visited only once, briefly, simply to confirm it was real, before returning to her ordinary routine at the diner, unable yet to imagine her life reshaped around numbers that still felt more like an abstract idea than an actual, tangible reality. It was Frank who finally nudged her toward action, several weeks after the legal dust had settled, catching her staring at Walter's old booth during a quiet mid-morning lull. "You know," he said, sliding into the seat across from her, "he left you this place too. You could do anything with it. Renovate it, sell it, turn it into something entirely different if that's what you wanted." "I don't want to change it," Claire said quickly. "I want to keep it exactly the way it is. This place mattered to him. It matters to me too. Then what do you want to do with everything else?" Claire considered the question for a long moment, her eyes drifting once more to the empty booth by the window, remembering the way Walter had always folded his napkin into a careful square, the way he'd counted his coins twice out of habit rather than necessity, the way his letter had asked her, gently but clearly, to make sure no one else ever felt as invisible as he once had before she'd started noticing him. "I want to start something," she said slowly, the idea taking clearer shape even as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "A program, maybe, here at the diner, and eventually beyond it. Free meals for elderly customers who come in alone, no questions asked, no charity implied, just a warm meal, and a seat by the window for anyone who needs it. And maybe something more too, some way of checking in on people who don't have anyone else checking in on them." Frank smiled, the expression softening the tired lines around his eyes. "He'd have liked that," he said. "A lot, I think." Over the following months, Claire poured herself into building exactly that. She used a portion of the inheritance to establish a small foundation, working alongside Eleanor Voss, who had become something of an unexpected mentor throughout the process, and Peter Lang, who eventually left his private investigation work behind to help coordinate outreach efforts connecting isolated elderly residents with volunteers willing to simply share a meal and conversation, the way Claire had once shared both with Walter, without ever fully realizing how much it had meant. The diner itself remained largely unchanged, the same patched booths, the same groaning coffee machine that Frank stubbornly refused to replace, despite Claire's gentle insistence, the same warm, familiar atmosphere that had first drawn Walter through its doors on that quiet Tuesday morning so long ago. But now, several mornings each week, the corner booth by the window welcomed a rotating cast of elderly regulars, each one greeted with the same warmth Claire had once offered Walter, each one given a reason to look forward to their mornings the way he once had. On the first anniversary of Walter's passing, Claire visited his grave alone, early in the morning before her shift began, carrying with her a single cup of black coffee, still warm, which she set carefully against the base of his headstone. "We started the program," she told him quietly, feeling only slightly foolish speaking aloud to a stone marker, though something about the ritual felt important, necessary even. 42 people so far, just this year, who don't have to eat breakfast alone anymore, unless they want to. I think you'd be proud of it. I think you'd probably tell me I'm still counting my coins too carefully though, even with everything you left behind." She smiled at her own small joke, wiping away a tear that had gathered unexpectedly at the corner of her eye, and sat with him a while longer, the morning sun slowly rising over the quiet cemetery, before finally rising and making her way back toward the diner, toward the booth by the window, toward another ordinary morning made extraordinary, simply by the quiet, steady practice of kindness, given freely, exactly the way Walter Doyle had once taught her it should be given, without expectation, without hesitation, and without ever needing a reason, beyond the simple fact that another person, however invisible they might have felt before, deserved to be seen. The bell above the diner door rang as she stepped inside, and Claire smiled, tying her apron around her waist as the morning's first customers began filtering through the door, ready, as always, to notice the ones who needed noticing most.